After this video, you're going to have grade 9 keywords, key quotes and analysis from every single act, and also pre-season intentions for the inspector. Only video you're going to need to revise the inspector, so make sure you watch to the end so you can get that grade 9 analysis that's most important for Act 3. So we're going to kickstart it with like an overall sentence that really describes the inspector. Precy crafts the inspector as a mouthpiece for socialist ideals and a catalyst, so kickstarts, for moral redemption, being saved from sin. He functions as a force of justice, exposing the moral failings of the upper classes and urging collective social responsibility. So that is a summary of how the inspector is presented. He's presented as Precy's mouthpiece. Now you're going to hear me say this quite a lot about the inspector, but think about it like this. Precy can't be in the play himself, so therefore he uses the inspector, he constructs him. Examiners love if you say that because it shows you're being intentional about Precy's intentions. He constructs him to vocalize his beliefs. And of course, Precy is a socialist, so the inspector conveys these socialist principles and ideas to the capitalist Burlings, and in particular about collective social responsibility, the idea of sharing responsibility between everyone in society. So before we go into each act, I'm going to give you a grade 9 keyword for every single act for Act 1, 2 and 3. So for Act 1, we're going to look at authoritative. Means he's very commanding, he has a lot of power when he comes into the Burling household. Act 2, we're going to look at mouthpiece. So like I just said, he's that voice of Precy. Precy can't be in the play himself, so he uses the inspector. And then Act 3, he is prophetic, meaning he can foreshadow, he knows things are going to happen in the future. So let's look at the inspector in Act 1. So let's go through our summary sentence to begin with. The inspector is presented as an authoritative figure who disrupts the Burling's complacency, establishing control over both the family and the narrative. So when someone's complacent, they're quite comfortable in the way that they are. So we can see the inspector disrupts this completely when he enters. We see that they're having this very pleasant engagement about Sheila and Eric's engagement. Then the inspector comes in, he interrupts the scene, and he has this authoritative power. And the evidence of the quote that we're going to use for this is cutting through massively. Now, it's also a really good thing to comment on stage directions, because when we comment on stage directions, it shows we're able to comment on the play form. And when we put stage directions in, we put them in little square brackets because quotes are in quotation marks, and then we use stage directions for square brackets to show the difference. Let's dive into a technique and analysis for this stage direction. The stage direction, cutting through massively, establishes the inspector's dominance, implying he is not merely an investigator, but a force capable of overriding the Burling's social status and sense of superiority. His interruptions disrupt their comfortable conversations, symbolizing the disruption of their privileged worldview. So think about it, he's not only interrupting the Burlings, but if the Burlings are a microcosm, so microcosm is when something small represents something larger, so the Burlings, they're one small characters, they're one small family, but they represent at large upper class capitalists. If the inspector comes in and he's cutting in, it's representing how socialism is going to cut in to capitalism. It's going to undercut because, of course, if the inspector has this authority, why is the reason he has this authority? It's because he's morally more powerful than the Burlings. So when it says about disrupting their privileged worldview, it's just like how socialism is trying to come in and disrupt these rigid, so like not easily broken, capitalist privileges that basically allows them to exploit the lower classes, as we see them do with Eva Smith. If you want grade 9 analysis for multiple quotes, critical interpretations for the inspector, we have it all on the Lightup Hub. Literally everything you want, not just for the inspector, but for every single character, broken down to key themes. You've even got quizzes, condensed notes, literally everything on there. I'm going to put a link in the description below to some of our free cheat sheets, so you can actually access our Inspector Call free cheat sheet if you haven't yet. Okay, now let's look at Precy's intention for the inspector in Act 1. So Precy's intention will be largely quite similar with the inspector because, of course, he's quite a consistent character because he consistently articulates Precy's beliefs. But let's look at how we can link this most particularly to the quote we just looked at. Precy challenges the rigid class hierarchy of Edwardian society by positioning the inspector as a figure who commands authority regardless of social rank. He advocates for a re-evaluation of power structures and emphasises that morality should transcend class. So our Act 1 Precy's intentions is really focusing on how authority does not come from social class, because of course we do not know the inspector's social class. We don't know if he's upper class, if he's working class. We don't find that out, yet he does have this authority. So therefore it signifies that authority is linked with morality, or power is linked with morality, not status. Typically, as the Burlings would see, they would believe that the higher status you are, the more power you have. But the inspector completely shatters that because he has the most power in Act 1 and we don't know his social status, but all we do know and we learn to find out is that he's a very moral character. Okay, let's dive into Act 2. Let's firstly look at our summary sentence to kind of summarize the inspector in Act 2. The inspector acts as Precy's mouthpiece, voicing socialist ideals and challenging the capitalist values upheld by the Burlings. So as mentioned, he is there to articulate Precy's beliefs and particularly, of course, to transcend the message of socialism to the audience, because by comparison, we can see how moral the inspector is, and of course, he holds these socialist beliefs, and how immoral the Burlings are, which of course are capitalists. So as an audience watching, we instantly side with socialism because we side with the inspector. So a key quote that we can look at to support this: public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. So this is him here critiquing Mr. Burling, but in particular critiquing capitalist ideologies in the fact that they believe they can have these privileges without having any consequence for responsibility or accepting any accountability for the actions they commit. So the technique we're going to look at is juxtaposition. Now, juxtaposition is just two contrasting ideas. So we look at the idea of responsibility and privilege. We can see they're contrasting ideas because being really responsible and being privileged typically is associated with being detached from responsibility or detached with consequences. So let's dive into some analysis. The inspector's authoritative tone conveys a moral lesson, juxtaposing responsibilities with privileges to expose the Burling's self-serving attitudes. This highlights his role as Precy's mouthpiece, advocating for the upper classes to acknowledge their duty towards society. So the juxtaposition actually highlights the difference between socialists and capitalists. Socialists are inherently more responsible, whereas capitalists are more inherently focused on privileges and absolving, so freeing themselves from responsibility. And what Precy is doing through the inspector here, he's advocating the idea of duty and responsibility. The inspector directly confronts Mr. Burling's lack of responsibility because he's too focused on privilege, because Mr. Burling is very focused on his public facade. So facade is almost like his image, his mask. But what the inspector is trying to convey is that the collective is more important than individuals. So i.e. society is more important than just Mr. Burling, because that's all the importance he places, because he only focuses on himself and neglects everybody else. So let's have a look at some Precy's intentions for the inspector in Act 2. Precy critiques the capitalist elite who prioritise wealth over welfare. Through the inspector, he promotes socialist values, urging the audience to reject selfish individualism and embrace collective responsibility. Selfish individualism, being individual, just means you're only focused on yourself. And we can see that, again, Precy has been very intentional with the way that he constructs the characters. He makes this selfish individualism, so focusing on oneself, synonymous, meaning closely linked, with capitalism, through, of course, Mr. Burling. But then he shows morality and responsibility to be synonymous, so closely linked, with socialism through the inspector. So again, it's this reinforcement that socialism brings people back to morality, whereas capitalism makes people more immoral. And let's lastly look at the inspector in Act 3. Now, the inspector in Act 3, such an important act, because this is when he gets his final speech. We really get to see the impact of his message on the Burlings and, of course, the message of socialism. So let's look at our summary sentence to begin with. The inspector assumes a prophetic role, delivering a final warning about the consequences of social responsibility. So remember, prophetic is kind of looking into the future. So we can see he's looking into the future of the consequences if we don't accept responsibility, or what will happen if people ceaselessly, so ongoingly, neglect and absolve, so free themselves from responsibility and the consequences of their own actions. So the quote that we're going to look at is, "We are members of one body, we are responsible for each other." A classic quote, which I'm sure so many of you do know. And the technique we're going to look at is a collective pronoun. Now, collective pronoun is when you're talking about a collective, so like we, us, our. So we're going to look at the collective pronoun on we. The inspector's use of the collective pronoun we reinforces collective responsibility, urging the characters and audience alike to recognise their duty to society. His speech transcends the immediate context, positioning him as a moral prophet, forewarning of the consequences of ignoring social unity. So we can almost see that he is looking into the future. He's prophetic because he's saying these are the consequences of us not being collectively responsible. It will lead to this destruction. It will lead to misery. And he's reaffirming almost these societal beliefs that we are members of one body. reinforcing what it means to be a society to both the characters like Mr. and Mrs. Burling and Gerald, but also to the audience. Just as he reminds the characters, he reminds the audience, and he reminds them of the importance of this collective social conscience. And we can see him almost as his moral prophet. So he's almost like looking into the future, but also morally as well. Let's lastly look at Precy's intentions. Precy advocates for socialism, urging a post-war audience to reject individualism in favour of collective welfare. The inspector's prophetic tone underscores the necessity of social change, warning that failure to embrace responsibility will lead to further suffering. So it's this idea that he is drawing parallels to how if we continue on this capitalist trajectory, it's like embodying these capitalist values, we will end in another war. We will end in continual suffering. And of course, this is significant because remember, the play is based in 1912. So the characters, Inspector, Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling, they're all in 1912. But Precy wrote this in 1945, which of course is post both World Wars. World War I started in 1914, World War II ended in 1945. So this is after 2 world wars. So the fact that the inspector is saying that if they do not take responsibility, if they do not become collectively responsible, there will be consequences, is of course very relevant for a 1945 audience who have first-hand experienced the consequences of not being part of a collective, not being part of a community, because they've just come out of their Second World War. So that is a bit of a deep dive into some Inspector analysis. If you did like this, guys, please do subscribe to the channel. It helps the channel more than you know. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna link another Inspector Calls video just up here to help you with your revision.